Hi, my name is Sarah Joy, and you are listening to Halidon Music's podcast series on the Baroque era. Today's episode, episode 1, is titled Courts and Churches. And before we get into that, I want to briefly explain what the Baroque era was. Today, people like to describe any music that they hear being played by an orchestra or perhaps being sung with an operatic vocal style as classical music, which I think that's a fine shorthand way of delineating between music that we listen to nowadays on the radio versus, the rest, the orchestral repertoire. That's fine. But music historians do divide that big genre of classical music up into specific musical periods. So you have Renaissance period, and then right after that is the Baroque era, which we're going to be talking about. After that, you had the actual classical music period, then you had the Romantic period, and so on. The reason why I think it's important that we do divide these, music history into these specific periods is that there are very unique stylistic characteristics in each one of them, and it's fascinating to trace compositional techniques, ways of approaching and conceptualizing music, just to trace that and see how it grows and changes over time and how it's affected by what was happening in history during that time, and to see how composers would build on the people that came before them. So that being said, the Baroque era, some of the stylistic characteristics of this time period was greater ornamentation, a lot of expressivity, rhythmic freedom, and you may not know what these terms mean right now, but I'm just going to say them and then we'll talk about them in future episodes. But one of the biggest differences that occurred in this period versus in the Renaissance period that came right before it is the use of polyphony and homophony. So we're going to talk about that and what that means and the kind of impact that it had on music going forward. Huge, huge deal. Some influential composers from this time, I'm sure you've heard of these people, J.S. Bach, Vivaldi, Monteverdi, Purcell, Lully, great composers, and again, we're going to be talking more about them in future episodes. But in today's video, we're going to be talking about the two major institutions that were able to support musicians, and these two institutions are the courts and the churches. So we're going to start out by talking about the courts. You have to keep in mind that during this time, this was the age of absolutism. So Europe had come under the control of rulers and monarchs. These rulers, with King Louis XIV kind of in the lead, they kind of competed with each other to see basically how cultured their courts could be. And so they wanted the best musicians, the best composers. They would spend so much money on these lavish sets, opera in the courts. That was a great way to show off your new technology with special effects. So they were willing to put a lot of resources and finances behind the productions that were given in their courts. A great example of a court musician was Lully, and his name is spelled L-U-L-L-Y. Now Lully, he was actually born in Italy, but they discovered him on the streets whenever he was, I think, 14, and they ended up bringing him to King Louis's court, where he developed his musical talents. He gained a lot of popularity and actually became quite wealthy by the end of his life. And he and King Louis stayed quite close. I think they had a slight falling out at the end of Louis's life, but it was quite rare for a composer to remain with a single patron for the entirety of their career. So if you want a great example of a court musician, do some research into him, listen to some of his pieces, and you'll get a very good idea of the kind of court music that was popular at the time. He died very tragically, by the way. I don't know if I should put this in this podcast, but yeah, Lully, they used to conduct with these big staffs or rods. They would function as metronomes. You would pound them on the ground and you would keep a steady beat. Poor Lully, he ended up stabbing his foot and it got infected, and he refused to let them amputate his leg because he wanted to keep dancing, so that's why he died. But anyways, that was dark. Moving on. Another great example of a court musician is Vivaldi. Vivaldi did not start out as a court musician, but he was eventually offered, and I'm going to look at my notes for this, he was appointed Maestro di Cappella of the court of Prince Philip of Hesse-Darmstadt, governor of Mantua in the northwest of Italy. I don't know how my pronunciations were just then, but I gave it my best. So during this time, Vivaldi composed the Four Seasons, which those are very, very popular, and I'm sure that you've at least heard of them before. But we're going to take a listen today. So this is a small portion of the Four Seasons Concerto Number 1, Spring, in E major. This is movement number 1. There are a couple exceptions of what I've been talking about, and one of them is the way that the government was set up in England. Authority was distributed and not entirely given to a single ruler, and that mindset did permeate the culture. And so instead of composers writing to make one person look good or to please that one single person, they did keep in mind the taste and the expectations of a broader public audience. The second exception is opera. Opera did begin in the courts, but it eventually made its way into opera houses that were built for the public. Unfortunately, it didn't make it all the way to the lower class, but the middle class were able to enjoy it, so bankers, merchants, businessmen, folks like that. Now let's talk about music in churches. J.S. Bach is one of the best examples of a church musician, and one of the things that I love about him is that even though he had a very strained relationship with the authorities, they were very demanding, very critical, he still did his very best. He created with integrity and excellence, and, I think he was able to do that. One of the main reasons why he was able to do that is because he knew why he was doing it. He had a sense of meaning and purpose. And I think that is summed up in one of my favorite quotes from him. This is, quote, "The aim and final end of all music should be none other than the glory of God and the refreshment of the soul." So I think having that sense of purpose helped him keep going despite his many frustrations. And even in his secular writing, he still carried that mindset, and he still produced with that sense of giving, if that makes sense. Let's go ahead and listen to Bach's Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring. Couple other famous examples of sacred music. You have Handel's Messiah, of course, and then you have Vivaldi's Gloria in D major. The list is endless. I could just tell you piece after piece of sacred music, but I think that these can get you started at least. If you go ahead and search those up, and you'll find more. Before this video ends, I do want to talk about the popular music of the day. So the popular music of that time was honestly, it's kind of similar to the popular music of today. Very informal, people just making up melodies to entertain friends at the tavern, to sing for their family around the fireplace in homes, sing while they work to keep themselves distracted. Unfortunately, those creators didn't really have the education or the means necessarily to transcribe what they came up with. But a few of these melodies and a few of these rhythms were preserved, and we do get to kind of have a glimpse into the past. And they were preserved by composers who would take certain melodies or certain rhythms and kind of integrate them into larger pieces, and they would transcribe them. So we do have sheet music that has lasted all of these years, so we can kind of get a glimpse of what the popular music was at the time. And a great example of this is the composer Scarlatti, who wrote his keyboard sonatas. He would take Spanish folk tunes and Spanish folk rhythms, and he would use those as influences on his own compositions. So let's go ahead and take a listen to a keyboard sonata in E major. As we wrap up today's episode, the one thing that was consistent through all of these contexts, so courts, churches, even just popular music, people making stuff up in the streets, the consistent thread through all of those was the constant demand for new. People were always looking for something fresh. And unfortunately, what that meant for some of the greatest composers who we consider great today is that by the end of their lives, they had already fallen out of popularity. So Bach, he lived to see his music fade away, and he really had no assurance that it would ever come back in the future. It finally had a revival, but I think that that's an important thing that all creatives can keep in mind, is that if you truly create with integrity and excellence, that kind of art has a way of persevering into the future despite what your current culture may or may not accept. So I don't know, I find that to be encouraging. Perhaps other creatives out there can as well. But I think that does it for today. So thank you for listening, and please stay tuned for episode 2.